Hi folks, hope you're okay today. It's quite late, 25 past 12, and on my clock here, it's a bit later there. Hope everybody's okay. Love to everybody out there. My website's jasonburnspreacher.com, jasonburnspreacher.com, jasonburnspreacher.com. There's loads of stuff on my website on theology, the Gospels, and loads of stuff about learning about Christianity, Reformed theology, looking at Islam, atheism stuff. So there's loads of stuff there for different types of people. And you can go from there onto my Twitter and Facebook, where there's lots of stuff as well. I should be uploading some articles and various other things that I'm writing in the next few weeks, so have a look on that in the next few weeks, the stuff that I upload that I've actually written. I've done about 7 hours study today on Bart Ehrman, Dr. Bart Ehrman, and concerning his view of the Gospels, his book Jesus Before the Gospels. I listened to a couple of debates, 3 debates. I've listened to him, his debate with Tim McGrew on Unbelievable concerning the Gospels. I listened to his debate to Richard Barkham on the Gospels, and also on Was Jesus the Son of God, a debate with Dr. Michael Bird. So that's like about 6 hours of debate, 2 hours with McGrew, 2 hours with Richard Balcom, and 2 hours with Dr. Bird. On top of that, excuse me, I've read a review. It's an 8-series review by a historical Jesus scholar, by a guy called Raphael Rodriguez, Raphael, Rafael, and then his surname Rodriguez. His Raphael's blog article. I'll just get the link. It's a very scholarly 8-part series. The book, the Gospels. He's reviewing the book. So the series is 8-part series. It's Thursday, March 31st, 2016. Before the Gospels, a serial review, part 1. Jesus blog, the historical Jesus.blogspot.co.uk. And the 8-part series there is a very helpful 8-part series that a very scholarly way. You hear his work on memory. So I just want to share my thoughts after studying and thinking about Bart Ehrman's thoughts about the Gospels and about the divinity of Christ. About 6 hours of listening to his debates and an hour reading this, which is a critique of his book. I just want to come to bring some thoughts to my mind Dr. Bart is a brilliant um, he's a brilliant debater. He's very, very good. In his debate with Richard Borkham, he really put Richard Borkham on the back foot. He really outmaneuvered Dr. Borkham. His debate with Dr. McGrew was not as, I think McGrew got the better of him. But it was still a very closely fought debate, even though it was supposed to be a discussion on the unbelievable show. With Dr. Bird, I think he was rattled there because Dr. Bird really brought a lot of good historical research, and that kind of flustered Bart. But you can't take it away that Bart is a very brilliant rhetorical debater. Secondly, Bart knows his stuff. He definitely has a command of the various sources and literature, whatever he's debating or discussing. So, but I want to bring a few pointers out specifically concerning his understanding of the Gospels and his ideas of memory. And I get this from his debates that he's had because he's used some of the scholarship for the book in these debates. I think the first point that I want to mention is methodology. I think when you're listening to Bart Ehrman, yourself, what is his methodology? He asked McGrew, "Are you an inerrantist?" And McGrew kind of like wouldn't give his game away whether he was an inerrantist. Now the reason why Bart did that is he wanted to expose publicly that McGrew had a bias. I suggest to you that every theologian, every historian has a kind of historical bias. And you have to call Bart Ehrman out on that. You have to ask him, what is your methodology? And what he will try to do, he'll try to position himself in the mainstream of historical scholarship concerning the Gospels. Is a lot of his ideas are not mainstream. If you read Dr. Hill's book on the Four Gospels, published by Oxford Press, he mentions in a chapter there that Bart Ehrman is part of a certain school of thought concerning the historical, concerning culture, concerning community development of text. Various theories about how the communities develop the written text, and he has theories about this. So I think it's important that you call out Bart Ehrman, if you're a scholar, on his methodology. What is his methodology? And hit his methodology hard. I mean, you can see that in any historical Jesus studies. You can see how Ramirez, how Schweizer, how many Dominic Crossan, how every scholar on historical Jesus studies has always had some kind of historical bias in some way, form criticism, etc. And so, what is the methodology? What is the strengths and weaknesses of it? And you find that Bart Ehrman will have theories about how community develop the text, and these theories, a lot of it won't be based in actual factuality. So you need to study that as a scholar, and as a Christian, you need to realize that every critic of the Bible has a bias, and you've got to find where that bias is, and not take for granted that they're trying to be objective, because they're trying to position themselves as being objective, but they're not. Just going to get some water. Excuse me. So that's the first point. The second point is, I think, cherry picking. What Ehrman does, he will say, well, we try to choose the historical bits of a gospel that are correct with our criterion, and then we leave stuff that isn't correct, that doesn't accord with our criteria. But often what he does is he cherry picks information from the gospels that he wants and disregards that which he doesn't want. That's what often the skeptics do. They'll say, well, we can't believe in the texts being accurate by eyewitnesses, but yet they'll have to concede that there are certain historical facts within the Gospels. For example, Jesus dying on a cross, that the disciples saw the resurrection, even though they might not agree that the actual resurrection took place. Bart Ehrman and others would accord to that as being factual. And then information is taken that they take that is helpful for them to make their argument, but then don't help their argument. So the cherry picking. So the question is, why the cherry picking? What reasons are they? Why are they making those decisions? Are they making those decisions based on factual evidence and looking at all the sources, or do they have an agenda? And I suggest that they have an agenda, that they're not being as objective as they claim to be. So for example, Bart Ehrman will say, that Jesus who Jesus was, it was an adoptionist Christology, and that it started via the resurrection, and then it developed over time in the church, and then from there the Gospels were written, and it was read. The baptism of Jesus is read back into the literature that wasn't really actual factual, in order to buttress this kind of adoptionist kind of Christology. So evidence of baptism then becomes evidence for this adoptionist kind of a hermeneutic throughout history. But there, it's taking one particular part of Scripture, i.e. the resurrection, and using that as a historical framework to suggest that a text is developed and that other parts of that text have been read into it because of that one particular piece of text, and then embellishing it with more of a historical context. So, for example, Bart would say, there are in Romulus that, there's a story of ascension there, but is it resurrection? Is it necessarily resurrection? Is there necessarily a comparison there? So what I'm saying is it's not actually looking at the data, the whole data of Mark in its entirety as a whole, and fairly assessing it in that way. We take a part of Mark, i.e. the resurrection narrative, and then use that as a hermeneutic for a historical development and reading back over the Markan text. So obviously there's not an objectivity there. There's a theory of development going on that is being imposed on the Markan material as an exegesis. So there's a theory of Christological development there, based not on the veracity and variety of the textual material of Mark. Basically, it's taking one aspect of the text, and then using that for a later analysis of Markan studies, and then also reading it in the future in historical development. So again, it's not actually scientific in its study of the Markan material. It should take the whole of the Markan material and dissect it and look at it in as a whole. And also, you know, I think the third thing which comes out as well is, so there's this cherry picking based on a theory, based on using certain texts or certain historical markers as a benchmark for reading the Markan text and other texts. It's a theoretical understanding being imposed upon the text, the history. We've looked at methodology, we've looked at cherry picking. These are classic mistakes that modern scholarship's been doing for the last 200 years, by the way. The third thing is use of sources. The use of sources. For example, quoting Romulus, quoting Jewish sources, saying that the Jewish sources can teach, like, for example, quoting Philo that he believed that Moses was a god. I think that often you have to go and check what the skeptics are saying about the sources. And a lot of the times when Bart's quoting these sources, there are debates about the actual meaning of those sources. So, for example, when he quotes Philo, it's not as clear as what he makes out to be when he's saying that Philo's saying that Moses is a god. Meaning in the same sense that Bart would interpret it as. So you've got to be very careful with these scholars, and when they say things about sources, you need to go the source, go and read the source yourself. And you'll find often they're misrepresenting the source, and sometimes Bart does that. And also makes false comparisons. The comparison of the beginning of the Roman Empire with Romulus being made into a god because of an ascension, it is not necessarily the same as the Christian position of Christ's ascension. You know, and that's a classic example of what a lot of skeptics do, is, and this is what it comes down to, is not being culturally specific, and I think this is the key. This is the key to deal with Bart Ehrman, and that is cultural specificity. Cultural specificity. The skeptics are not very good at looking at the specific culture when they're studying the Gospels. What skeptics often do is they, and I'm thinking of 200 years of New Testament studies. What skeptics generally do is they generally have a theory. So, like Bultmann had a theory of community development. Bart has the same, a theory of how text developed by community. Bultmann had a kind of theories, and Bart has a kind of theory, and so they have these theories. And then what they tend to do is they make generalities, statements, comparison. So, like Bultmann said that, you know, the Greek material in the ancient world is more applicable to looking at the Gospels than material. Bart Ehrman will say, well, let's look at some aspects of Jewish culture and Roman culture and make comparisons. But that these are generalities that are made. about certain about aspects of the ancient world and then apply to the Gospels. So, for example, he'll say that there were these beliefs in gods, even in Judaism, other gods. And then he'll say that, similarities of accession can be seen in Roman literature, like Romulus. So there are these generality statements made of comparison with the Gospels. And that's one of the great weaknesses of modern scholarship, is it's not culturally specific. There needs to be much more detailed analysis in the Jewish culture of that time. There needs to be much more a differentiation between the Roman culture and the Jewish culture, etc., and the between the culture of the Gospels as opposed to the culture of Rome, or the culture. You see what I mean? You've got to look at it, things in their cultural specific aspect. I think that people like scholars like Adam Schlatter and Gresham Machen understood this. So the danger in Bart Ehrman, the making general statements based on only a few studies of sources, rather than being culturally specific and doing more an in-depth scientific study, is another weakness of Bart Ehrman, which has been a weakness of a lot of modern scholarship for the last couple of hundred years. I think the fourth thing is reinventing the wheel. There's been a lot of studies in anthropology. Bart mentions in his book, and mentions this, that there are people like John Miles Foley, Elizabeth Tonkiv, David C. Robin, Werner Kelbert, Albert Ford, Jack Goody, Walter J. Ong. These are anthropologists and thinkers in the area of memory, oral tradition, etc. They've written premier works on these things, and a lot of the New Testament scholars have begun to engage with this kind of literature and how it affects New Testament studies. But that's nothing new. It's nothing new. Gunkel and von Rad in Old Testament studies, Gunkel on the Psalms, von Rad on the Pentateuch, many years before, engaged with in the work of Scandinavian scholars of their day, who looked at oral tradition, and they used that work in order to understand the gospel. So what's happening now with the over the last 10, 15 years of scholars going back to studying anthropology and there's nothing new in that. That was done 80 years ago. And so I'm not discounting the value of that. There'll be a lot of valuable information and help that can be done. But the danger is to bring all that scholarship, and this comes also into the study of memory, the danger of studying psychology. So you study modern psychology and the studies in memory, which are often artificial studies. They're not as well established as Bart Ehrman and others present them to be. And they take these studies and also the anthropological studies, and then they look at Judaism of the first century, or they look at the Gospels, and they impose this 21st century scholarship on as a hermeneutic into understanding the Gospels. And again, it makes the massive mistake of not being scientific in a true sense of the word, is that it's not allowing the actual sources of the time to speak for themselves. So there's an importance again for being culturally specific. And James Dunn has tried to do that a bit, and there are others that have tried to do that. But we need to be very, very careful that these studies of anthropology, of other cultures, and studies in psychology get imposed as a hermeneutic, and we're not actually listening to the cultures, the ancient culture that we're actually studying, and looking at it from within, and looking at the wide breadth of information within that culture. That's another big problem. The other thing as well is the unfair skepticism in these kind of discussions. What you tend to find with skeptics is they tend to raise the bar of skepticism higher for the Gospels than they do they tend to raise the bar of skepticism for the Gospels as ancient literature compared to other ancient literature. So, for example, the argument will go by Bart Ehrman that the Gospels were anonymous, we can't know who they were, blah, blah, blah. There isn't much evidence, we have papiers, we have RNAs, blah, blah, blah. There's not much evidence, blah, blah, blah. We don't know the authorship of these Gospels, etc., the authors of these Gospels. But if we were to look at the same way we look at ancient literature, look at Herodotus or the Iliad or Tacitus or Josephus or any other ancient literature, and we judged our understanding of how we know that they wrote these writings and what the conclusions we make, if we was to apply the same criteria, we would never know what any writer wrote. But scholars accept views, all right, there might be debates, there's debates in every area of scholarship. Acceptance of that certain writers write certain books. All right, there might be debates about one or two books, like, for example, there might be a debate about a work of Aristotle or a couple of works of whatever. But generally speaking, we'll know certain books that are written by certain authors in the ancient world. And it's generally accepted because there's a general criteria and they meet that criteria. There's a general tradition there. And it might not be a strong tradition, but we kind of accept these books. Yet we doubt the Gospels, and yet the Gospels have more attestation to their authorship than, say, ancient literature. So, for example, we have multiple attestation. We have Irenaeus, we have Papias, we have the Moratorium fragment, and we have the quotations of these Gospels. Again, not being fair to the overall evidence of the attestation that these Gospels were written by the certain writers. Why would the Gospel writers be quoted by the early church fathers if they were totally anonymous? You might argue and say, well, the early church fathers didn't quote the four Gospels. When they're quoted, they don't say Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But the fact that they're being quoted shows you that they're authoritative and shows you that they're part of the community as authoritative data. Why is it the Gnostic Gospels quote the four Gospels? It shows you that they're authoritative. So, if they were anonymous, they would not have that same authority. They just wouldn't. So there are multiple lines of evidences that attest to the authorship of the Gospels, that the names attached to them are the ones. And there was research, I did a video a couple of years ago, but there's been recent research over the years of manuscripts that have been found near Pompeii, ancient manuscripts. And what you find with these ancient manuscripts is that the authorship of the manuscript was put at the top. Well, I can't remember exactly, but there was a label put on the manuscripts. I don't know, I can't remember if it's top or bottom, but there was a label. It's a couple of years since I made this video and did some research on this. But there was on these manuscripts that they found in a library near Pompeii, these ancient manuscripts had labels on to attest their authorship. And what that concluded, what that showed, is that literature, ancient literature, had traditions going with the authorship. So it'd be nonsensical to say that the four Gospels were anonymous. They would have had a tradition of authorship, as attested by the literature at Pompeii. So where was I going with that? So yeah, so the Bart of skepticism, what Bart Ehrman will do is he'll just throw all that away. He'll say, no, that's not important, that's not valuable. All right, they might quote the Gospels, but they don't actually mention the Gospel writers, so that evidence is not helpful. Papias, you can't really rely on Papias. And Irenaeus, well, he was against the heretics, and he's a later date. He's like 2nd century, so he's not valuable. But hang on a minute, you use all that data in the secular world, and that would be way more helpful, way solid attestation for the authorship of a particular books. But not for Bart Ehrman or skeptics. They're pushing the bar too far. So that's another problem. So is there any more issues? Yeah. The next issue I want to state is historical studies and making claims from historical studies. Well, yeah, two things really. I think that's it. Couple of things really. I mean, all the things that I mentioned to you over the years, over the last 4 or 5 years, studying this stuff and engaging with this kind of material over the years, and debating with skeptics on the internet. You know, these are lessons that I've learned anyway, and it comes out in reading the literature, debating skeptics on the internet who are not as well informed as they make themselves out to be, and really just looking at this topic as well over the years. So just listening to these debates by Bart Ehrman, really these issues have come up before. I've mentioned them before. I've made videos on these topics over the years. So, you know, these are lessons that, and also like my reading, I have studied like for 10 years in academic theology. So I'm used to reading books on the history of theology, on the history of New Testament studies. So when you're trained in that kind of thing, you have a very good view or very good understanding of the historical development in scholarship. Once you have a really good grasp of the relationship between philosophy and New Testament studies, it really helps you to grapple with people like Bart Ehrman. You know, so I know that I'm very well aware, where the general public wouldn't be aware, you wouldn't be aware even as a minister, of how philosophy gets into New Testament theology, New Testament studies, and historical Jesus studies. You wouldn't necessarily be aware of that. And also, because I'm I've always been strong in theology and methodology. When I was at seminary, we studied Karl Barth, and the lecturer lectured on Karl Barth. And I went and did my own research on Karl Barth, and I studied intensively his methodology. And I went to some leading thinkers, scholars in the area of Barthian studies concerning Karl Barth's epistemology. So I've always been keen to get to the heart of a theologian, or get to the heart of a scholar, get to the heart of the issue. And a lot of it's to do with methodology, a lot of it's to do with Worth the method methodology. And that's what that's what I've really been unpacking for you here. I would need to do many hours more research on Bart Ehrman if I was to. I mean, I'm not even there as a scholar when it comes to people like Bart Ehrman to debate or anything like that. But you know, obviously, I'd have to do a lot of research if he was going to debate someone like that. But I can help you, having been in academic theology for like 10 years, hundreds of lectures by people like Bart Ehrman. I can help you to, as a minister, I can help you as a Christian, I can help you as a skeptic to deconstruct these kind of people. Because I have some tools that in my armory that can deconstruct these people. The thing to deconstruct is you've got to be careful about the statements about the times of Jesus in terms of literary theories and educational theories in the first century. Bart Ehrman has made in the past and continues to make statements about in his debates, the debates that I watched. He mentions that the Gospels couldn't have been written by the writers because they were illiterate and they didn't have a high understanding of Greek, and so they couldn't have written the Gospels. Now, this is based on studies that have been done, and the information that we have is that there are a few aristocrats who were from a Jewish background that wrote in Greek, for example, Josephus, and they didn't find it easy in writing in excellent Greek. Josephus, apparently, so Bart Ehrman says, has to need help in writing Greek, or more classical, excellent Greek. Malcolm mentions that it's the Greek in the New Testament Gospels is simplistic Greek. But the point is this, is that Bart Ehrman has made statements like this before on his views of literary development of text, concerning scribes and the educational ability of certain scribes at certain times in history, i.e. the first century. And he's making claims about the Gospels couldn't have been written because it was only the aristocrats that were excellent in Greek. Again, here's the point that I want to get at. Theories about how can I say? I would call them esoteric, assumptive theories about literary and educational development in first century Palestine. They're assumptions, and they're esoteric in that they're creative. You have to do your own research. You have to do your own digging. You shouldn't just take on board certain theories about education or literacy levels in the first century in Jerusalem or wherever. Because a lot of these studies are very esoteric. They're theory laden, based on factual information, as much as they make themselves out to be. For example, the average middle class person in the first century throughout the Roman world would have access to libraries. There were key libraries throughout the Roman world that were there for people to go and study, for you to send your boys there to study, where they would have the Greek classics. All right, that's just one example um, of something that you would not find in academic research from the Bart Ehrman school of thinking, unless you actually did a bit of your own research and digging. And if you find something like that out, that puts a question mark on his ideas about education in the Roman world. And the same goes when it comes to Jerusalem and education and literacy levels there. I think you should be very, very careful. I think as a scholar, you should go back over the sources and recheck the sources, because here's one of the other problems that you need to be aware of as a scholar, and also as a general public, which puts a question mark upon all the ideas that Bart Ehrman and many of these kind of scholars have, is that if you read Josephus, the literary development, both in its historical and literary form, there was a priestly class. And that priestly class had the role of preserving the historical and literary information of the time. So that was so that puts a different spin on it. A certain class of people who were trained to be educated in the preserving of the literary, historical, and cultural reference of a certain people. You can find that information by reading Josephus. So that fact alone, if you weren't aware of it, puts into question these esoteric theories about literacy and education, and that the Gospels couldn't have been written by the disciples because they didn't have the suave, sophisticated Greek, which only the aristocrats would have had. It gives a big open question to that kind of theory. The other thing as well is, it seems to be coming from a narrative, a certain historical reference or narrative that is looking at, that seems to have a residue of kind of leftist Marxist kind of understanding of history, that it's the capitalist or the powerful that are in control of history, and there seems to be a vestige of that within the historiography of that kind of idea. Why is it not impossible for ordinary peasants to learn Greek? It's not impossible. That's just a throwaway comment. My main argument is this idea of priest is very central. The priestly class was very central in terms of preserving the literature of the time. So what that means is there would have been people trained, and if the disciples were going to synagogues, they would have been in contact with these kind of people, and that they couldn't have imbibed that kind of culture or been trained up in that culture themselves is not an impossibility. So in other words, you've got to question these theories about literacy, what come out sometimes. You've got to question it, and always go back to the sources. That's the big thing. You've got to go back to the sources, and when you go back to the sources, often what scholars are saying can be overturned by just looking at the sources yourself. Because again, the last 200 years of scholarship in New Testament studies has often not been scientific, in the sense They claim to be looking at the sources, but they don't look at the depth, the variety, and specifically all the sources. What they tend to do is cherry pick according to their esoteric theory of literary or community development of ancient texts. That has always been the problem, and it continues to be the problem. And they might study anthropology or they might study memory studies, but it comes down to this. They're not doing things the way Adolf Schlatter would do it. They're not doing it the way Theodore Zahn would do it. They're not doing it the way those kind of scholars would do it. And that is to be more scientific and rigorous in looking at the sources in their variety, is to speak for themselves. Now, obviously there will be minutiae studies, a specialist who might study certain archaeological developments that we're finding. I don't take that for granted. I don't take away the fact that there are many scholars doing specific grand studies in certain areas in New Testament studies in archaeology and philology and whatever. I don't take that for granted. But generally speaking, practitioners fail to be scientific, truly so, in looking at the vast array of sources and allowing truly the sources to speak for themselves, is often overlaid with theory-laden esoteric views of community development. And I think that's what Bart Ehrman's doing ultimately. So the motto is really go back to the sources yourself, study yourself, and you'll find often that scholars, you can correct modern scholarship in these areas by going to the sources yourself and finding out for yourself. All right. Thank you for listening and take care. God bless. Don't forget my website, jasonburnspreacher.com. jasonburnspreacher.com. And I hope that what I've shared with you has been a help. And please pray for my work, my preaching and evangelism, and the work that I do in evangelism in the UK. I need your prayers. And I hope this has been a help to you. If you're a theologian, a philosopher, or a thinker, I hope this has stimulated you to rethink things. You know, you want to go back to reading Josephus. Just read it again and again, read him again and again, and just go slowly as a scholar. Just do it. Just keep doing it. Keep doing it. And as you do it, you'll find time and time again a lot of things that scholars say. You'll look at things in a fresh light and bring new articles, new discussions to the table. And it's the same with Philo and many of these ancient pieces of literature. Just go back again and allow them to speak to you. Just listen. Don't come with perceptions of whatever the scholarly debates have been the last 30 or 40 years. Just go back to the material afresh. Allow it to speak. And when you allow it, you'll get fresh insight. And a lot of the things that you've been debating as scholars, you'll be writing articles where you're overturning the accepted thing, because we often miss what's obvious before our eyes because we're theory-laden contextually with theories of development, community and manuscript development, rather than just allowing the sources to speak for themselves. All right, thank you for listening and take care. God bless.